African history, origin and establishment of Sierra Leone. Origin and establishment of Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone was founded in 1787 when British philanthropists started agitating for ways of ending slave trade and slavery. The Sierra Leone Company was formed and given a duty for settling freed slaves. The British government financed it together with other humanitarians. In 1787, the Sierra Leone Company started resettling the liberated slaves. The initial number brought from Britain was 290 blacks, ex-slave men, and 41 women. Together with those were 70 white prostitutes and murderers and 6 white street children. Those whites were social foremen to their society. The Sierra Leone Company also sent 38 officials and craftsmen to govern them and teach them some skills. In the opening years of the 19th century, the Sierra Leone Company was finding it increasingly hard to bear the expenses of the colony. The dissatisfaction with and revolt of Nova Scotia settlers against the company's administration, the Temi attacks on the colony in 1801 and 1802, the feeling of insecurity among the settlers and their unwillingness to carry on farm work as a result of this state of affairs turned the company into a commercial failure. It therefore appealed to the British government to relieve it of the responsibility of running the colony. On January 1, 1808, the British government took direct responsibility for the colony and Sierra Leone became a crown colony. From 1808, the British government appointed governors who ruled the colony as representatives of the king. The recaptives were made up of people from many nations, but the most dominant groups were the Yoruba, Igbo, and Asante. As time went on, many recaptives left their villages and moved to Freetown in search of fortune, and after acquiring enough wealth, they emigrated to their native land or other coastal towns of West Africa. The name Creole was originally applied to receptive children born in the colony. At first, the older groups of settlers discriminated against the recaptives and their children. But by 1850s, owing to the growth in wealth, education and influence of the recaptives, and also to intermarriages, the old distinctions had disappeared and the older group and recaptives had merged into one Creole community with its own distinctive cultures and civilization. Creole culture had a peculiar trait. It was a curious blend of Christian, European and American culture and African traditional culture. For the Creoles were Christians, wore European dresses, lived in European style of houses and practiced monogamy. But they spoke their own style of English Creole and kept the traditional customs, diet and dances of their native lands. This Creole culture gave to Sierra Leone a national identity of its own. Significance of Creole community to Sierra Leone and West African history. Sierra Leone and Liberia are sometimes referred to as a nursery bed of 19th century West African civilization because it was in Sierra Leone that Creoles emerged and spread the social, political and economic ideas to that African history, origin and establishment of Sierra Leone. As the first British Crown colony in West Africa, Sierra Leone from 1808 also marked the beginning of British imperialism in West Africa. From there, the British were achieved colonial expansion in the Gold Coast and Nigeria with aid of a squadron based at Freetown. Thus the sovereignty of West African states suffered the first real imperialist assault in 1808. Owing to the pioneer efforts of European and American missionaries, education took firm root in Sierra Leone earlier than any other West African country. It was from here that the generation of educated West African teachers, missionaries, civil servants, professional lawyers, doctors, magistrates who played a significant role in West African affairs during this period that was produced. For instance, Samuel Adjei Crowther, who was the first Negro West African bishop, and he spread Christianity to Niger territories, James Africanus Horton, the first West African medical doctor, and John Thorpe, the first West African lawyer. The Creoles became evangelists and were instrumental in the spread of Christianity in West Africa. The ex-slaves were already Christians and the recaptives were easily converted to Christianity. In 1861, the Sierra Leone Anglican Church was founded. Creole missionaries were sent to Ghana, Gambia, and Nigeria. The most significant of these was Samuel Adjei Crowther, who became a bishop in 1864. They pioneered the formation of African independent churches like Bishop Adjei Crowther, who formed the Sierra. The Owen Anglican Church in Niger and other churches were formed in different areas, including the Niger Delta Church, Native Baptist Church, whose preachers were Creoles. As regards trade and commerce, the Creoles took the leading role. They got initial capital from the British colonial government and philanthropists. They helped in the development of legitimate trade. From 1840s, many Creole merchants migrated from Sierra Leone to other countries of West Africa and established there. Like R.B. Blaze, born in Freetown, became one of the richest in Lagos. Horton James from Gloucester became one of the richest in Bathurst, Gambia. Many Creole traders were in 1890s operating business in Monrovia, Accra, Cape Coast, Cameroon. They thus owned both small and large-scale enterprises not only in Sierra Leone but also throughout West Africa. By 1890s, they owned merchandise ships operating on Atlantic Ocean. They were also a factor in the development of towns in West Africa, especially in Sierra Leone. Freetown was the principal center for their settlement and it grew into an important town. Some coastal towns and their immediate hinterland areas developed into towns. In other parts of West Africa, they contributed to the expansion of towns and ports like Accra, Lagos, and Ibadan. Since Creoles were highly learned and with administrative skills, they were favoured by the British, who used them as administrators. They therefore served as colonial agents. They became secretaries, interpreters. African history, origin, and establishment of Sierra Leone. They were significant in the modernization of transport system. They played a role in the construction of roads and railways in Sierra Leone. They constructed a railway from Freetown to the interior via Wellington and Waterloo. Another line began from Papel to Lanza. They also owned ships on the Atlantic Ocean. They built schools, and by 1868, 22% of the West African population had been educated. More schools were built, like Fort Bay, which began as a teachers' training college in 1827 and attained a university status by 1876. And Walsh Institute for Girls. By the second half of the 19th century, Creole education had produced good clergymen, teachers, doctors, lawyers in West Africa. The notable products of this education included John Thorpe, the first black lawyer in Sierra Leone; William Davis and Africanus Horton, the first black doctor of Western medicine; Ajay, the first black Protestant bishop; and Samuel Lewis, the first newspaper editor and first African to be granted the Cambridge University degree. Joseph Cladis edited the West African Reporters and Sierra Leone Weekly News. They studied and edited over 300 African languages, translated the Bible and other books of universal significance into local languages. In the publication field, Creole intellectuals from Sierra Leone contributed to publication of books, articles, magazines, and newspapers. Vital to remember was Samuel Johnson, who wrote the first book about the history of Yoruba; Dr. G.B. Horton, who wrote the first medical topography of West African coast in 1860; Bishop Ajay Crowther, who wrote on grammar and vocabulary of Yoruba language; ABC Sibthorpe, who wrote on Sierra Leone's history and geography; Dr. J.F. Eastman, who was head of Ghana Medical Services, widely researched on Black Ghana River, while Dr. Augitola Sapa started the first Pono Small Box Society of Lagos. The African nationalism and demystified artificial European superiority based on color differences. They also founded the civil rights groups of the Africans. Since freed slaves were able to maintain the independence of Liberia became a model of African freedom and liberation, and also Gold Coast. However, the Creoles had some negative aspects looked at from the African perspective. For example, they accelerated the loss of African independence. They suppressed African revolts and defeated resistors. This was exemplified in the Temne Mend War, the Yoruba War, and the Sant-Vant British Wars. They annexed land for themselves and their British bosses. They thus led to displacement of Africans from their land. In trade, they outcompeted Africans who were forced to withdraw from trade and became economically weak. Their culture was largely foreign in nature and therefore an abuse of their identity. Due to their cultural arrogance, they denounced local people as primitive and satanic. They claimed racial superiority over the local people. They mistreated their fellow Africans through overtaxation, forced labor, and land grabbing, and were partly African history, origin, and establishment of Sierra Leone. The Hut Tax Temne Mend War of 1898. In 1896, the British declared a protectorate over the British Zone of the Interior and put it under the control of Sierra Leone colonial government under Frederick Kodjo as governor. The governor introduced administrative changes in the protectorate, i.e., district commissioners, and each district had a paramount chief and a frontier police that was responsible for keeping law and order. After 2 years, the people of the protectorate rose against the colonial people's Creoles and their government, and this was referred to as the Hut Tax Temne Mend War on one side and the Creoles, later the British, on the other hand. The causes were political, economic, and social. Causes of the revolt: introduction of hut tax in 1897 of 10 equals to bigger houses more than 3 rooms and 5 equals for on smaller houses or its equivalents in palm oil or rice. This was to fulfill British policy of making the Temne Mend to finance the protectorate. Forced labor because settlers and the colonial government lacked adequate manpower. Cultural arrogance of the Creoles took themselves superior to Africans, were thus employed in administration because of their education attained from missionary influence. Land alienation in its 1896 Land Ordinance Act on land allocation. All land in Sierra Leone with mineral resources was declared Crown land. Waste/uninhabited land was allocated to white settlers. Missionaries in association with Creoles, their teaching undermined the traditions of the Temne Mend. Was a popular desire for independence. District commissioners in Sierra Leone conflicted with the traditional authority of chiefs. People with no traditional authority and legitimacy were appointed by the British. In addition, the judicial powers of the chiefs were greatly eroded. Justice was administered by the district commissioner and their agents who were ignorant of the customary law, e.g., imprison people not in conformity with customary law. Temne Mend detested Creole traders to whom they were losing economic power. British administration had placed the control of trade in hands of Creole traders. Abolition of slave trade, which was lucrative. Forced military conscription and frontier police force. African history, origin and establishment of Sierra Leone. Foreigners and their agents. Role of religion. Maladministration of the British and their agents to Creoles. Inspiration from other rebellions in West Africa. Effects. Loss of lives, especially Tenni men and Creoles who lacked a sense of belonging. Reduction in status of Creoles and their influence were blamed by British for causing the war. War ended in complete subjugation of Sierra Leone and loss of independence of the poor. Rebellion leaders were victimized by Burea was taken prisoner only to be released when he was sick and weak. Hot tax which the Tenni men had fought to remove was enforced. Africans were respected as the frontier police force became to be disbanded. Many Africans were recruited in new police force. Land laws were revised and hot tax was reduced to favor the Tenni and men. Although Tenni and men never regained their independence, the end of the war led to restoration of the dignity. Their political and economic powers were relatively recognized. Creoles lost monopoly to big British trading firms that worked with African middlemen to exploit natural resources of Sierra Leone. Creole education in the interior was changed as British intention to extinguish Creole influence not only in Sierra Leone but British West Africa, and this had a negative civilization effect.